And as we have seen unfolding over the last few years, particularly for the last 10 or 12 years, since the trade agreements came into operation, we have seen that India-ASEAN relationship has evolved phenomenally. Having said that, we know that the institutionalization of this relationship happened in 2009 with the Free Trade Agreement on goods, and in 2014 with the Free Trade Agreement on services. And now we are engaged in another very, very crucial process of RCEP negotiations. When would it happen? How would it happen? What will happen out of it? Well, these are all still questions left to the future. We really don't know which way this all is going to work out. But there are lessons from our experience, and I would prefer to speak on some of these rather than get into. First of all, I want to eschew myself from commenting on statistics, because I am neither good at recounting statistics, nor do I think it's necessary to do so, because all those who are present here are fully familiar with the statistical dimension of India-ASEAN trade relationship. But having said that, if you look at the trade figures and the figures that I have seen for the year 2016, you can very well see, you can very well discern the huge growth in bilateral trade between India and ASEAN, particularly post 2009. It will not be appropriate on either side to say that they have not benefited from the agreement, though there have been a sizable number of naysayers within India who have, in the last few years, been adversely commenting upon India's FTA relationships, whether it's ASEAN or it's Korea or Japan. Well, I won't comment on Korea and Japan at this moment, but I am quite sure about India-ASEAN, and I strongly believe that the relationship has done well to both the parties. India has also benefited, and if you looked at the figures, and if you minus the staples like coal and edible oil and a couple of other products, then clearly you can see that there is a significant amount of balance. But I think what is important is what is the kind of quality of this trade on both sides. Now, what had driven India-ASEAN economic engagement was essentially driven by two factors. One was that India would find, and this was in the larger rubric of Look East and Act East, broad strategic persuasion that India adopted. But I think more important is to look at the trade figures on the benchmark of two basic developments. One was, to what extent were we able to latch on to the value chains that ASEAN was already part of? And at the point which Dr. Mohan Kumar also mentioned earlier. And two, looking at the geographical continuity of the regions, to what extent have we become seamless? Because in my opinion, if you have to integrate two economies as vibrant as ASEAN and India, the test should lie in to what extent there is a certain amount of seamlessness, not just in terms of physical seamlessness, that is the road connectivity or the multimodal connectivity, but also in terms of how easy it is for our businesses to communicate, to relate, to meet each other, to talk to each other, and so on and so forth. Now, a whole lot of changes have been brought out on both sides in the visa regime, and significant amount of work has been done in that direction. But to take the issue of connectivity first, my take is that, and I was discussing this yesterday with Dr. Pradeep Dey also, having been in the Department of Commerce for 10 years, I have been following up the developments on this side. But let me frankly confess that there is a long way to go. While there is no doubt a lot of physical structure which has come out, but there are missing links, and I don't want to speak on the specifics because we are all aware of that. I think it is an extremely important factor in the larger context of economic integration, that the physical connectivity, whether it is multimodal or simply road, is achieved. Because that also lays down the paradigm within which India-ASEAN economic relationship would prosper in the next decade or so. It is not just important for that, it is also important for India's own developmental objectives. The northeastern part, the eastern part of the country, and I think it is extremely important to open these areas to prepare a mechanism for evacuating products and services from these areas. And in my opinion, the manner in which this has gone, creditable work has been done, and I'm not underplaying that work. But what is important at this moment is to fasten this, to hasten the process of completing this work, because that is what will determine how seamless, how connected we are. There are political issues on both sides, and I think they need to be sorted out. It's easier said than done, but I think it is very important that the issue of physical connectivity receives the top position in the agenda. The second point, which is related to physical connectivity as well, is using the elements of physical connectivity for economic development. And a point which is very closely related to this and the other point of value chain, to which I'll come later, is to what extent India has been able to utilize the opportunity of leveraging India-ASEAN relationship in the context of making investments and being part of value chains with the CLMV part of ASEAN. Now, there have been discussions going on for a pretty long time. I have myself participated in this exercise on several occasions. We have visited Vietnam n number of times. There have been propositions on the table for integrating the textile sector on both sides. But what I gather, I left the Department of Commerce in 2015, but apparently nothing much has happened after that. Not that I was motivating the whole thing, but the fact is that both sides have not really worked harder and stronger and shied away from building up a strong relationship, which is necessary not just in the bilateral context, but also important for India to piggy ride on a larger emerging global mechanism. We are all aware of the TPP. 4 countries in ASEAN are part of TPP. TPP may not have the blessings of one large partner, but clearly it is a reality to come. And when that happens, where would India find itself? So I strongly thought that it was important for us to pursue this CLMV agenda, not with just a perspective of India finding a foothold on the TPP value chains, but also to see that this integration brings in the right kind of values in terms of improving competitiveness to ASEAN's textile sector. So I think it is extremely important that this agenda is followed up, it's pursued again. Now, having said that, the third point that I want to mention is, I come to the value chain issue. Now, clearly, one of the biggest advantages, and I really don't know at this moment whether this has been driven by the fact that we executed these 2 agreements, the goods agreement and the services agreement, but the fact is that Indian industry and correspondingly the ASEAN industry has benefited by development and evolution of some value chains. There is no doubt that there are value chains emerging in automobiles, there are value chains in textile sector, gems and jewelry, and so on. But how much has India benefited out of it? I think that's a crucial question. Now, I don't know if anybody has done a specific study up to a firm level to see how has India approached, accessed these value chains, and to what extent the benefits have flown into India. I'm aware of the factor that the lead players in automobile sector have definitely helped in getting India onto these value chains. But I am still conscious of the fact that India has been largely on the backside of the value chains. India has been largely been on the back stream, and therefore the amount of value that India could have obtained out of this is clearly not there. Now, that is not to say that there is any unfairness with India. The fact is that India has to come up to that point to be able to access these value chains at a point where they approach the market directly. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge for India. Technology is a challenge, competitiveness, logistics, trade facilitation, etc., are the issues. There are areas where India is in the front of the value chains, for example, pharmaceuticals. But clearly India's rising dependence on China for bulk drugs clearly shows that this value chain has not adequately, has been impressive adequately. And I think we really need to look at that. Bulk drugs is 95%, I am told 90% of India's bulk drugs are coming out of China these days, APIs. Now clearly we are completely subjugating ourselves to China as far as and we are just becoming a formulation country. This is not the way it used to be. This is a large challenge to India ASEAN. And this is also important in the context of the strategic dimension of relationships that we have been talking about. And the India-ASEAN discussion gets the largest impetus out of this strategic flavor of this relationship. And therefore, I think we need to look at very strongly, very intensely into how to build these strong value chains, because India's position as a formulation country is not threatened at the moment. Though now with the technology developments in the pharmaceutical sector, a whole lot of new product areas, the biosimilars, etc. are coming. But I think it is very important that we secure this formulation-based access to markets through a more dedicated and a more congenial environment of sourcing APIs from South Asia and Southeast Asia. I think that is a big challenge. Having said that, I come to a sore point, which Dr. Mohan Kumar had also mentioned, and that is the service industry. Unfortunately, my experience of the time when we were negotiating the agreement on goods, and then we followed it. First of all, when we negotiated the agreement on goods, the take was that we are looking east, so forget about services at the moment. Let's look east, and let's fructify that looking east by way of an agreement, and therefore we hastened through that process. Now, having hastened through that process, we thought the services agreement at some point in time would come up to our satisfaction. But let me confess that the agreement that finally was concluded was an absolutely insipid agreement. And it was an insipid agreement because we didn't get the right traction from ASEAN. We see more or less a similar, or rather a more nuanced reaction when we are negotiating our CEP. Now, clearly, when we are talking of strategic dimensions, when we are talking of complementarities, when we are talking of integration, and when there is a clear recognition that there is competitiveness in India's services industry in several sectors, there is no reason why India should not find a foothold in ASEAN services market. Why embodied services in the manufactured products coming out of ASEAN, or all of those value chains that we talk about, why India should not find a place in those embodied services? Now, this is a big challenge. Now, one reason which I could fathom was India's over-obsessiveness with Mode 4. And very often ASEAN has reacted to this situation because apprehending that India's persuasion, or rather persuasiveness about Mode 4 will bring Indians all over ASEAN, particularly the lesser developed regions of ASEAN. Well, I think India needs to work harder on seeing that its perceived over-obsessiveness of Mode 4 is dealt with. There is potential, there is huge potential in Mode 2. There is huge potential on Mode 1, which is well, there are hurdles, but is definitely looking at the telecom sector's evolution in India. There is a huge potential out there. There is Mode 2, and clearly Mode 3 has shown its success. The manner in which investments have flown from some of the ASEAN countries into India and from India into some of these ASEAN countries is clearly an indication of the fact that there is a huge potential on that side. And if, as we see, the manner in which Japan, Korea, China are focusing their manufacturing activities in ASEAN and also in India to some extent, there is a strong reason for us to pursue this agenda and not feel obsessed with Mode 4. There is a strong reason for us to pursue Mode 4 because we feel our strength there, particularly driven by information technology sector. But there is no reason, for example, why we can't access Chinese market through ASEAN. We have not been able to access Chinese market. A number of times our technical representatives, our diplomats, our technical experts, etc., have been to China and have been assured of market access. But it has just not come. How do you break the SOE stranglehold around Chinese services market? How do you get access into